Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable to you, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. Amen. So writing the Remembrance Day sermon is an interesting exercise for me every year. Prior to seminary, I did think a lot about war and conflict, things like that, but even then, I don't think I would have thought about joining the military myself. I'm a history major, and I grew up with the the History Channel. Actually, I think it's become the reality television channel, but at that time it was the War Channel. And I think had the military been an option for me, and had I had to go to war, I probably would have just went. I think I wouldn't have thought too much about it. But seminary planted the seed of pacifism in my head. I had a professor that was a declared pacifist. And now every November I sit back and I wonder about how comfortable with problem solving by force I am. And every year I think I edge closer and closer to pacifism. This year I think I'm almost ready to call myself a pacifist. But frankly, I'm a little scared of the commitment that comes with a label. Let's be clear, Jesus' solution to violence was to walk to the cross. The Roman Empire was a double-edged sword, tremendously advanced but very cruel. The Israelite culture had become fractious and corrupt, with the religious authorities grasping at power and little splinter groups planning uprisings everywhere. War and violence hung over first century Jerusalem like a thick pea soup fog. Did anybody catch the fog this morning, by the way? It was beautiful. Kind of like that, I suppose, but with less sun. Jesus opposed it strongly, but he didn't fight. He didn't even defend himself. When it came time, he allowed himself to be taken to the cross. And so I want you to think about, what did the cross accomplish? And I'd actually like you to set the resurrection aside for a moment, because I think when we focus on the resurrection too much, we lose sight of some of the other things that it did. So let's set that aside. What happens when a radically peaceful man is put publicly to death? What happens when a whole crowd realizes that they had the opportunity to free an innocent man? And later, what happens when the Romans start crucifying peaceful Christians en masse? Well, the surrounding culture takes notice and changes. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it, is what Jesus said. That's a heavy burden. It's a very heavy burden. But it works. Now, more and more, I'm coming to the belief that Jesus could not have done what he did outside of the Roman Empire. Or perhaps a better way of saying it is that God plunked Jesus in first century Rome very intentionally. Pax Romana, the Roman peace, is essential to the gospel story. For one, Israel had to be subjugated for everything to happen that happened. They had to be upset and waiting for a Messiah to lead them to a rebellion. But also, I think a sense of law enforcement was needed. And it was around this time with Rome that military and law enforcement were starting to diverge. And despite the methods, it did create an environment that was relatively safe, especially compared to the times. It created an environment where you could talk without having to be able to fight. Because fighting was pointless in the Roman Empire at that time. The Romans were far too big, and Israel found that out shortly after Jesus' death when they did rebel. Go back further in biblical history, and I don't think that's so easy. While it's really far back, our reading today about the Battle of Jericho illustrates it pretty well. Israel had just crossed into the Promised Land. Now what? If you you go back just a couple of verses, they're eating their first meal after the manna had stopped falling. Can you imagine eating like saltines for 40 years and then having produce from the land? That would have been staggering. That's just a couple of verses earlier. Well, one of the first things Joshua does in the promised land is circumcise all the military men. That's what we do, right? Or all the military-aged men. You guys didn't see, but as soon as I said that, Cheryl went, wow. Thank you for that, Cheryl. It's kind of an odd thing to do, right? I guess it makes more sense in the Old Testament time, but the generation who had remembered Egypt died in the desert. This was a new generation, and this circumcision, it's symbolic that they were ready to fight. It's identifying that they had a whole generation of military-aged men that could now fight. Moreover, they needed to fight because they got into the promised land and there was other people there. Now, I'm constantly up here talking about empire and pacifism, and you're probably tired of hearing it at this point. How do I justify Israel waltzing into Palestine and kicking out the longtime residents? Kind of sounds familiar, doesn't it? Except this was at least 3,500 years ago. Well, I can't justify it. I don't have a good answer, but I think that's kind of the point today. Let's look at how hopeless this situation was. Israel at this point had no home. They'd been in the desert for 40 years, basically enough time for a generation to live and die in those days. They'd been in Egypt for quite a while before that, and before that they were sort of a fairly small tribe that was kind of wandering, and so they didn't have a home. They'd escaped Egypt. They had nowhere to go. They had to go somewhere, and they believed that God had promised them the west bank of the Jordan. And I swear I'm not intending to draw any parallels, but wherever they settled, they were going to displace someone. Conflict was coming. And in those days, there was diplomacy, but they really didn't think of anything. They didn't think anything of going to war. Life was harsh. Life was cheap. And to be frank, kings were little more than tribal warlords in those days. Even King David. We hold David up on this pedestal, but that's what being a king in those days was. Even if Israel came in peacefully, we know that they didn't, but even if they did, conflict was inevitable. And that's what I'm getting at today. The world is complicated. Just as a thought experiment, the First World War is sort of a hangover from a different time. Political tensions and alliances dragged us all into the biggest conflict in the world to that point. And then lingering tensions and unrealistic reparations then sparked the flame for the Second World War. The Second World War is really just a continuation of the First World War with 20 years in between to simmer and ferment. The Second World War effectively laid the groundwork for the Cold War, which had its own respective conflicts like the Korean War and especially, obviously, Vietnam. And it was the Cold War that laid the groundwork for the current conflicts in the Middle East. We were using the people of the Middle East to fight the Russians. The post-war economic boom and the building of suburbs started us on the path to the 2008 financial crisis and was sort of what began tensions with the people that we had just been working with in the Middle East. And that, combined with the existing wars in the Middle East and business interests, let's not forget those, have led to the deep polarization in our culture that we're facing today on a daily basis. In fact, I'm speaking a little out of turn here, but I think you could draw a pretty clear line from Archduke Franz Ferdinand, whose assassination started World War I, all the way to Donald Trump, and I suppose Joe Biden today. It's been know what? You probably can only draw that line in retrospect. You could never have seen all this coming 50 years ago. And maybe if you could, nobody would have believed you. There's just so many moving parts and plates to keep spinning. It would have been impossible. So a minute ago I said that I don't have a good answer for how Israel should have entered the Promised Land 3,500 years ago. And that's kind of the point. Israel didn't have a home, and the act of settling somewhere was going to displace someone else. Let's set the whole Promised Land thing aside. The decent land was claimed. There's no good answer. Now, compromise is clearly the answer. Acknowledging that Israel needed a place to go and other nations were already there. Coming to some sort of agreement where all parties recognized that they weren't going to get what they wanted, but they could at least coexist peacefully if they got along. In other words, all sides, I have both sides written here, but really it's all sides because there's many different tribes that they were dealing with. All sides being vulnerable enough to talk is the key. All sides being vulnerable enough to compromise. All sides being vulnerable enough to create a relationship with a stranger. But let's recognize that's asking a lot, and for all our advancement today, it doesn't even happen today. And when it doesn't, our soldiers pay the price. Now, standing here today, I am very thankful for the gospel message that developed. We don't always follow it. Sometimes things get out of hand because of actions and agreements long ago that we've got no control over, but we've got the legacy of, and conflict happens. Sometimes it happens because we don't listen openly and we're not vulnerable enough to listen. Sometimes it happens because we're not vulnerable enough to let go of our own interests. Ask Canada's Indigenous people about that one. Just to be clear, I'm saying that we weren't listening to them. We were not the ones that were vulnerable. But I think we do see a clear road to peace. The challenge is we need to be vulnerable enough to choose it.